Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Gossips 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Taylor Hayes had always believed she understood pain. She was a psychiatrist after all, trained to name it, trace it, sit with it until it loosened its grip. She had survived betrayal, divorce, loss, and the slow erosion of a love she once believed was eternal. But nothing in her years of education or experience prepared her for the moment her entire reality cracked open. Not loudly, not with screaming or shattered glass, but with a single sentence spoken too calmly to be anything but devastating. It happened in Brooke Logan's living room. The late afternoon light slanting through the windows in that golden, deceptive way that made everything feel safe when it wasn't. Taylor stood near the fireplace, arms crossed more out of habit than defensiveness, watching Brooke pace like a woman carrying a truth too heavy to hold any longer. Ridge sat frozen on the couch, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the floor, already knowing, because Ridge always knew before anyone else, that this was the kind of moment that changed lives forever. When Brooke finally stopped pacing and looked at Taylor, there was no triumph in her eyes, no satisfaction, only terror and regret, and a grief so raw it made Taylor's stomach tighten. "Taylor," Brooke said, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady. "There's something you need to know. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Taylor opened her mouth to respond, to reassure, to ground the moment, but Brooke didn't give her the chance. The words came out in a rush, as if once spoken, they might lose some of their power. "Thomas isn't your biological son," Brooke said. "He's mine. Thomas is my son. Ridge and we conceived him before you even knew you were pregnant." The room seemed to tilt. Taylor felt it physically, like the floor had shifted beneath her feet. Her ears rang, her vision blurred, and for a terrifying second, she wondered if this was what dissociation felt like. The mind's emergency exit when reality became unbearable. "That's not funny," Taylor whispered, forcing a small, brittle laugh that died instantly when no one joined her. Ridge finally looked up, his eyes glossy, filled with a shame so deep it only confirmed Brooke's words. "It's true," he said quietly. "I didn't know at first. When you found out you were pregnant, Brooke didn't even realize she was. The timing, it overlapped. We had a DNA test done years later. I begged Brooke to keep it quiet. I thought I was protecting everyone." Protecting everyone. The phrase echoed in Taylor's head like a cruel joke. Protecting who exactly? Certainly not her. Certainly not the woman who carried Thomas for 9 months, who held him through fevers and nightmares, who defended him when the world saw a troubled boy and she saw a wounded one. Taylor's legs finally gave out, and she sank into the chair behind her, her hands gripping the armrests as if that alone could keep her from shattering. "You're telling me," she said slowly, each word carefully placed, "that the child I gave birth to, the child I raised, the child I have defended with my life, isn't mine?" Brooke's eyes filled with tears. "He's still yours," she said desperately. "Biology doesn't change." "Don't," Taylor snapped, the sudden sharpness in her voice startling even herself. "Don't you dare tell me what does or doesn't change. You don't get to soften this." Her gaze shifted to Ridge, and the hurt there was so profound it bordered on rage. "How long?" she asked. Ridge swallowed hard. "Years," he admitted. "Long enough that I convinced myself it didn't matter." Taylor laughed then, a hollow sound that broke her own heart. "Didn't matter," she repeated. "So my entire marriage, my entire family, my entire sense of self, none of that mattered enough for the truth?" Memories began crashing over her in relentless waves. Thomas as a newborn, his tiny fingers curling around hers. Thomas as a child, clinging to her leg when Ridge and Brooke fought. Thomas as a teenager, angry and lost, searching for something he couldn't name. Had that emptiness always been the echo of a truth buried too deep to reach? "Does he know?" Taylor asked, her voice barely audible now. Brooke shook her head. "No. And I didn't want him to find out like this. I wanted to tell you first." Tell her first. As if that was some kind of mercy. Taylor stood abruptly, her movements unsteady, her breath shallow. "I need air," she said, already moving toward the door. Brooke reached out instinctively, but Taylor recoiled. "Don't touch me," she said quietly, and the distance in her tone was far more cutting than any scream. Outside, the cool air hit her like a slap, but it did nothing to clear the fog in her mind. Her world, The one she had built brick by brick, belief by belief, had just been destroyed by a truth that should have been told decades ago. And somewhere across town, completely unaware, Thomas Forrester was living his life, carrying the weight of his own sins and struggles, not knowing that the foundation of his identity was about to be ripped away. When Taylor finally looked back at the house, she realized with a sudden, sickening clarity that nothing inside those walls would ever be the same again. Brooke Logan's secret hadn't just rewritten the past, it had detonated the future. And as Taylor wiped the tears from her face, one terrifying thought rose above all the others. If this truth came out, it wouldn't just destroy her. It would destroy Thomas too. Taylor didn't remember the drive home. Later she would recall the steering wheel beneath her hands, the blur of traffic lights, the way her chest felt too tight to pull air into. But the details vanished as soon as they formed, swallowed by shock. Her mind kept circling the same impossible sentence, over and over again like a wound she couldn't stop touching. Thomas is Brooke's biological son. Not might be. Not there's a question. Was. Certain. Proven. Fact. When she finally pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had, warm, familiar, safe. And the sight of it nearly broke her. This was where she had brought Thomas home from the hospital, where she had rocked him through endless nights while Ridge traveled and Brooke drifted in and out of their lives like a storm they could never outrun. Taylor stood in the driveway for a long time, her hand resting on the car door, her body refusing to move forward as if crossing that threshold would make the truth permanent. Inside those walls were photographs, Thomas at every age smiling beside her, arms wrapped around her neck, eyes full of trust. And now she wondered how many of those moments were built on a lie she never consented to live. When she finally stepped inside, the silence was unbearable. No laughter, no footsteps, no familiar hum of life. Just the echo of her own breathing, uneven and shaky. Taylor walked through the living room slowly, touching the furniture as if to reassure herself it was real. Her gaze landed on a framed photo on the mantel, Thomas at graduation beaming, his arm around her shoulders, Ridge standing proudly on his other side. Taylor reached for it, her fingers trembling, and for a split second she considered throwing it across the room. But she didn't. Instead, she pressed the frame to her chest and slid down onto the couch, the sobs coming without warning, without restraint, ripping out of her like something feral and raw. This wasn't just betrayal. It was theft. Years of truth stolen from her. Years of informed choice denied. She had devoted her life, her career, her emotional energy, her sacrifices, to being the best mother she could be. And now she was being asked to reconcile that love with a reality that told her she had been living someone else's story. Across town, Thomas sat alone in his office at Forrester Creations, staring at a design sketch he couldn't focus on. His mind had been restless all day, a vague sense of unease following him like a shadow. He didn't know why, only that something felt off like the air before an earthquake. He had tried to lose himself in work, but every line he drew felt wrong, every idea unfinished. Finally, he pushed the sketch aside and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His relationship with his parents had always been complicated, Ridge's distance, Taylor's unwavering devotion, Brooke's omnipresent influence, but lately, it felt as though the ground beneath all of it was shifting. He told himself he was being paranoid, that years of guilt and mistakes had trained him to expect catastrophe. Still the feeling lingered. Unsettling. Insistent. Like a truth hovering just out of reach. Ridge, meanwhile, sat alone in his own house, staring at his phone, knowing exactly who he should call and being unable to bring himself to do it. Taylor. Thomas. Either call would detonate what little peace remained. Brooke's confession had forced his hand, and now the carefully constructed silence he'd relied on for decades had finally collapsed. He had convinced himself the truth no longer mattered, that biology was secondary to love, that Taylor was Thomas's mother in every way that counted. But the look on Taylor's face when Brooke spoke the words told him just how wrong he had been. Love didn't erase deception. It didn't excuse it. And Ridge knew with a certainty that made his chest ache, that when Thomas eventually learned the truth, it wouldn't just rewrite his past, it would reopen every wound he had ever tried to bury. The phone buzzed in Ridge's hand, startling him. Brooke's name flashed on the screen. He let it ring out. The next morning came too quickly. Taylor hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, memories resurfaced, Some tender, some painful, all now tainted by doubt. She stood in the kitchen, staring into a mug of untouched coffee, when her phone rang. Thomas. Her heart clenched. She considered letting it go to voicemail, but the thought of avoiding him felt unbearable. She answered, forcing her voice into something resembling normal. "Hi, sweetheart," she said. There was a pause on the other end, and Thomas exhaled softly, as if relieved just to hear her. "Hey, Mom," he replied, the word landing like a punch to her chest. "Are you okay? You sound tired." Taylor closed her eyes. Mom. The word she had earned 1,000 times over, now suddenly fragile, as if it could be taken from her. "I'm fine," she lied gently. "Just didn't sleep well." Thomas hesitated. "I was thinking we could have lunch. There are some things I've been meaning to talk to you about." Her breath caught. Was this it? Had Ridge or Brooke already told him? Panic flared, sharp and immediate. "Of course," she said, steadying herself. "I'd like that." After they hung up, Taylor rested her hands on the counter, grounding herself. She didn't know how long she could carry this truth alone, but she knew one thing with devastating clarity. If Thomas was going to hear it, it shouldn't come from anyone else. At Forrester, Brooke moved through the halls under a cloud of whispered glances and half-finished conversations. She felt exposed, as if the secret she'd kept buried for so long was already written across her face. Guilt gnawed at her relentlessly. She told herself she'd done the right thing, that Taylor deserved the truth, but that knowledge did nothing to ease the dread building inside her. She knew Thomas. She knew how deeply his sense of identity was tied to his parents, to his place in the family. And she knew that when he found out, he would look at her not as a mother reunited with her son, but as the woman who had helped destroy his world. Brooke paused outside Ridge's office, raising her hand to knock, then lowering it again. Some wounds, she realized, couldn't be softened by good intentions. They could only be endured. Lunch with Thomas was torture disguised as normalcy. They sat across from each other at their usual table, the familiarity of the place only amplifying Taylor's sense of unreality. Thomas talked about work, about hope, about trying to be better, to do better. And Taylor listened, nodding, smiling when appropriate, every word slicing deeper into her resolve. She studied his face, searching for signs, for some hint that he already knew. But he didn't. He was open, vulnerable, trusting. Finally, when there was a lull in the conversation, Thomas reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You've always been there for me," he said quietly, "even when I didn't deserve it." Taylor swallowed hard, tears burning her eyes. "I will always be there for you," she said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. But as she spoke, she knew the time for silence was running out. The truth was a ticking clock now, and when it went off, there would be no undoing the damage. As they parted, Taylor watched Thomas walk away, her heart breaking anew with every step he took. She had spent her life helping others confront painful truths, guiding them through grief, trauma, and loss. Now she faced the cruelest irony of all. The truth she carried threatened to devastate the person she loved most. And somewhere deep down, she feared that when Thomas finally learned who his biological mother was, he might look at her not with gratitude, but with confusion, anger, and a question she didn't know how to answer. "If you're not my mother, then who am I?" The truth finally surfaced on a day that should have been ordinary, which somehow made it crueler. Thomas was at Forrester Creations early, the building still quiet, the kind of calm he usually welcomed. But that same unease from the day before had returned, heavier now, pressing against his chest. He barely noticed when Brooke appeared in the doorway of his office, her knock soft, hesitant, like she wasn't sure she deserved to be there. "Thomas," she said gently, "do you have a minute?" He looked up surprised. Brooke rarely sought him out alone anymore. Their relationship had always been complicated, strained by the past, scarred by mistakes, but there was something in her expression that immediately put him on edge. "Yeah," he replied slowly. "What's going on?" Brooke stepped inside and closed the door behind her, and in that moment Thomas knew. He didn't know what, only that whatever she was about to say would change everything. She took a breath, then another, clearly struggling to steady herself. "I should have told you a long time ago," she began. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Told me what?" he asked, his voice sharp despite himself. Brooke met his eyes, and when she spoke again, her voice cracked. "I'm your biological mother." The words hung between them, heavy and unreal. Thomas laughed once, short and disbelieving. "That's not funny," he said, echoing Taylor's words from the day before. Brooke shook her head, tears spilling freely now. "I'm not joking. I wish I were." His mind rejected it instantly, scrambling for logic, for denial, for anything to make the sentence collapse under its own impossibility. "My mother is Taylor Hayes," he said firmly. "She gave birth to me. She raised me." "She is your mother," Brooke said quickly, desperately. "In every way that matters. But biologically—" "Stop," Thomas snapped, rising from his chair. "Just stop." He paced the room, running a hand through his hair, his breathing uneven. "You expect me to believe this now? After everything?" Brooke stepped forward. "Ridge and I had a DNA test done years ago. It confirmed—" "You had years," Thomas interrupted, fury rising fast. "Years to tell me. And you didn't." His eyes burned as realization set in, sharp and merciless. "Does she know?" Brooke hesitated. That pause told him everything. "Oh my God," he whispered. "You told her before you told me." Silence answered him. Something inside Thomas cracked open then. Not loudly but deeply, like a fault line splitting beneath his feet. His entire life flashed before him, recontextualized in an instant. His resentment toward Brooke. His desperate need for Taylor's approval. His constant feeling of not quite belonging anywhere. Had he been sensing this truth all along? "Get out," he said quietly. Brooke flinched. "Thomas, get out," he repeated louder now, his voice breaking. Brooke hesitated one last time, then turned and left, closing the door behind her. Thomas stood alone in the office, the walls closing in, his reflection staring back at him from the glass, familiar yet suddenly foreign. He didn't remember collapsing into the chair. He only remembered the overwhelming urge to call one person, Taylor. When Taylor's phone rang, she knew before she answered. Her hands trembled as she lifted it, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear Thomas's voice when he spoke. "Is it true?" he asked, his tone flat, stripped of emotion. Taylor closed her eyes. This was it. The moment she had been dreading, preparing for, and still felt utterly unready to face. "Yes," she said softly. "It's true." There was a long silence on the other end, so long she wondered if the call had dropped. Then Thomas spoke again, his voice raw. "So what does that make you?" The question sliced straight through her. "It makes me your mother," Taylor replied, tears streaming down her face. "The woman who loves you more than anything in this world." "But you're not." He stopped himself, his breath hitching. "Why didn't you tell me?" Taylor's voice broke. "Because I didn't know for years. And when I did, I was afraid. Afraid of hurting you. Afraid of losing you." Thomas let out a shaky laugh. "Looks like that worked out great." "Please," Taylor said, desperation creeping into her tone. "Come home. Let me explain." Another pause. Then quietly, "I don't know where home is anymore," Thomas said. The line went dead. Taylor's collapse came later, after the adrenaline wore off and the weight of everything finally crushed her. She sat alone in her living room, staring at the door, half expecting Thomas to walk through it, half terrified that he never would. Her phone buzzed with missed calls, from Ridge, from Brooke, but she ignored them all. This wasn't their pain to manage. This was hers. And Thomas's. She replayed every moment of his childhood in her mind, clinging to the certainty that her love had been real, untainted by bloodlines or secrets. But doubt crept in anyway. Would he see those memories the same way now? Or would every mom he'd ever spoken feel like a lie? Across town, Thomas wandered the streets aimlessly, his thoughts spiraling. Brooke's face when she told him. Taylor's voice on the phone. Ridge's silence. Everyone he trusted had known something fundamental about him that he hadn't. He felt exposed, humiliated, and impossibly lonely. And beneath it all was a fear he couldn't shake, that if Taylor wasn't his biological mother, then maybe her love had been conditional too. That maybe at some point it would fade. The confrontation everyone had been dreading finally exploded that evening at Brooke's house. Taylor arrived unannounced, her composure shattered, her pain laid bare. "You destroyed my family," she said. her voice shaking with barely restrained fury. Brooke stood her ground, tears in her eyes. "I told the truth," she replied. "I couldn't live with the lie anymore." "You lived with it just fine for decades," Taylor shot back. "While I raised your son." The words hit Brooke like a slap. "He's not an object," Brooke said. "He's a person. And he deserves to know who he is." "And what about what he needed?" Taylor demanded. "What about his stability? His sense of safety?" Their argument escalated. Years of resentment and rivalry boiling over. Every old wound reopened and weaponized. Ridge arrived in the middle of it, his presence only adding fuel to the fire. "Enough," he pleaded. "We're tearing each other apart." Taylor turned on him, her eyes blazing. "You already did that," she said. "Years ago." When Thomas finally walked in, the room went silent. He looked exhausted, hollowed out, his pain written plainly on his face. "Stop," he said quietly. All three of them froze. "This isn't about you fighting over who ruined my life," Thomas continued. "This is about me trying to figure out who I am now." His gaze shifted to Taylor, and for a heartbeat, everything else faded. "You raised me," he said. "You loved me when I was impossible to love. Nothing changes that." Taylor sobbed openly, relief and grief crashing together. Then Thomas looked at Brooke. "And you," he said softly, "are a truth I wasn't ready for." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. As Thomas walked out again, this time with intention, each of them understood that the damage was done, but the story was far from over. Trust had been shattered, identities rewritten, and the fallout from Brooke's long-buried secret would continue to ripple outward, testing every bond it touched. For Taylor, the world she knew was gone, but the fight for her son was far from finished. And for Thomas, the journey to reclaim himself had only just begun.